This video is made in response to one broadcast in the summer of 2022 in which Rabbi Tovia Singer made a number of critical remarks about Catholic beliefs and practices. The three areas which he focuses on are idolatry, intercessory prayer, and the Eucharist, which is the central worship ceremony of most of the Christian churches and has been for 2,000 years. It seemed incumbent upon me to address these objections or corrections of his position, each in turn. And since taking idolatry, intercessory prayer, and the Eucharist would require at least 10 minutes, if not more, they have been broken down into three separate responses, which I will take up in turn.
Ask, why does the Catholic Church stick to the worship of images when the Torah clearly forbids it?
The answer is because of their wickedness, that's why. I say it with such a broken heart, because I only want that all these Catholics should repent.
So, according to Rabbi Tovia, 1,300,000,000 to 400,000,000 Catholics, along with another 300 to 350 million Orthodox, as well as another 100 to maybe 150 million Protestants, all of which have some form of iconography or statuary or stained glass windows in their churches, which they use to enhance their prayer lives and their religious ceremonies. They are all practicing idolatry, according to Rabbi Singer, because they are wicked. What a broad paintbrush of condemnation to just sweep over something 2 billion people. But is this really idolatry? Well, let us look at a paradigm instance of the idolater's belief and practice at work, as described in Isaiah chapter 44. Here's what Isaiah writes in verses 14 through 17, just to get to the essence of it. Here's what he writes. They cut wood out of the forest which the Lord planted, and the rain made grow, that it might be for men to burn. And having taken part of it, they warm themselves. Yea, they burn part of it, and bake loaves thereon. And the rest they make for themselves gods, and they worship them. Now he turns here to the individual idol maker. Half thereof the artificer, the idol maker, burns in the fire, and with half of it he bakes loaves on the coals. He eats and is satisfied. And of the rest he makes a graven god, and worships and prays, saying, Deliver me, for thou art my God. Now, even if a neighbor or friend came by, and this artificer, this idol maker, talks him into worshiping that idol, he would be just as guilty of idolatry, whether he made the idol or not. And the reason is because there's no reality beyond what they are worshiping. At best, it's only a figment in their imagination, something which they used to replace the true deity, of which they know very little, if anything at all. They're kind of like what modern-day idolaters do, that think that money, wealth, power, fame, being an influencer, all of that sort of stuff, that is so important that that's what they devote their lives to, at the expense of any concern for God or their eternal salvation. But is this what Catholics do, or with the statues in their churches, or Orthodox with the many beautiful icons which they have that decorate their churches, or in those Protestant churches which have statues or stained glass windows? Of course not. We're not that silly. We're not that obtuse. The people who are silly are the ones who think we're that obtuse. But really, that's not at all what's going on. Now, even if Rabbi Singer allows that Christians aren't so obtuse as to believe that the statue or icon or whatever does not hold any luminous supernatural properties, but only points to a reality, whether it's Mary or some other saint, he still considers this idolatry because he deems it a violation of the commandment. But is it? To answer that, we need to ask why the Israelites were forbidden to make such images. And it had to be because the only true reality that they were familiar with was the one that was revealed to them through Abraham and later Moses, that was incapable of being symbolized in any physical form. How in heaven's name could one ever reduce the creator of the universe, even a simplistically and imperfectly understood cosmos of the Israelites, into any materially limited object? No way possible. So to avoid them confusing whatever image they might come up with as being equivalent to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that transcends all physical things, they were forbidden to do so. But is that the case with Christians, employing such objects to focus their personal prayers or using them in communal worship service, identical to the condition of the Israelites? Of course not. Just as with ordinary statues and photographs and other ways that we have of recalling things that are important to us, we use these to remember the person or event that served a significant role in salvation history. But it is very clear to us that the statue or icon or whatever is only a token or a sign of something beyond itself. People have photographs, sculptures, and other objects in their homes, and even with them there is a kind of value significance we give them. We wouldn't place a formal, professional family photograph encased in an expensive frame, for instance, in a kitchen or a storeroom or bathroom or dark hallway. Now, we put them in a more honored room in the house than that, a living or dining room where it can be easily and continually seen by family members and visitors. We put other less valuable, less meaningful stuff in those other rooms for decorations. But we never confuse these with the actual realities they represent. Rabbi Tovia demonstrates in his objection to the supposed idolatry of having religious imagery in churches an ignorance as to the sources in Christianity that had dealt with this issue in the past. Theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas, and even more importantly, church councils like that of Nicaea in 787. In the 8th century, in the eastern half of the Christian world, a Byzantine emperor raised these same objections about imagery as had some of the later reformers and Rabbi Singer as well. This in spite of the fact that iconography had been a centuries-long established tradition in the eastern part of the world. Still, this became such an issue in the eastern part of the Christian world that it was decided by church authorities that an ecumenical council should be called to debate and settle the issue. While the council debated many issues about church life and practices, this is the result of their deliberations on the use of icons in the church. They declared with one voice that the sacred icons of our Lord Jesus Christ are to be had and retained inasmuch as he was very man. Also, those which set forth what is historically narrated in the Gospel, and those which represent our undefiled Lady, the Holy Mother of God, and likewise those of the holy angels, for they have manifested themselves in human forms to those who were counted worthy of the vision of them, or of any of the saints. Furthermore, these are to be portrayed on tablets and on walls, and upon sacred vessels and vestments, as has been the custom of the Holy Catholic Church of God from ancient times, and so on. Now, if Rabbi Singer wants to call this idolatry because he's focusing on just one verse in the Tanakh, he's welcome to do so. But he's not applying the description of idolatry that is found later in the book of Isaiah, which should also be one of his primary sources of reference. I have to note that in the Christian scriptures, there's an example of where some of the dietary laws that we find in Torah are changed as a result of the different dispensation which exists between God and man and creation as a result of the redemptive activities of Jesus Christ. There's a section in the Acts of the Apostles where the Apostle Peter is up on a rooftop, I think it's in the town of Jaffa, where he all of a sudden gets a vision of a sheet that comes down from heaven with all the animals on it, and he's told by a voice to go ahead and eat any of these, and he's taken aback by this. No, this is a violation of Torah. But he's told in this vision that what God has now made clean, man should not consider as defiled. So there's a question here, is there also something of the same kind of change, analogously, with the use of imagery and statuary in any kind of a worship ceremony? The arguments that we have pretty much are between human beings and their opinions and their views on things. However, is there something that comes to us that is above and beyond this, which would justify the use of imagery in our worship services? Above and beyond the words and opinions and arguments of men, Jesus has left us with an image of himself. And here it is, at least part of it, the face on the shroud of Turin. Now, if Rabbi Singer ever, by some way out possibility, long shot possibility, watches this video and he hears those 4 words, the shroud of Turin, he is likely to throw up his arms and say, "I've already settled that. It's a fraud. Science has said so. The Vatican agrees that it's a fraud. And it's the only thing, or the best thing, that Christians have to hang their hopes on as to the veracity of their religion." Well, I have to say to Rabbi Singer, if he does come up with this, or a devotee of Rabbi Singer, one of his disciples, say that's already been settled, that no, it has not, and that he is wrong on all 3 counts. I think it would be instructive for just a moment to take time to look at the historical record, the timeline, the key dates of our historical knowledge of the Shroud of Turin since it came into the Western world, and what has occurred as a result of that advent. The first historical record that we have of the Shroud in the Western world is 1349, when it is brought to Liry, France, by one Geoffrey de Charnay, who was a participant in the Fourth Crusade. This is significant because that crusade ended with the sack of Constantinople, and it appears that it is at that point that possession of the Shroud passes from wherever it was in Constantinople to Geoffrey de Charnay. There is biological evidence that confirms the Shroud's presence in that region, pollen and other material that could only have come from there and that is not found in France. Ownership of the Shroud was transferred to the Duke of Savoy, and he placed it in a chapel that he had built or constructed for it. In 1535, a fire caused scorch marks and other damages, which we can still see on the Shroud today, of course. In 1578, the Shroud arrives in Turin, Italy, at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where it has remained until the present day. Prior to this, there was not widespread knowledge of the Shroud in the Catholic world. It was only in those regions where it had been housed, or to which it had been taken on certain occasions in order to be displayed in other parts of southeastern France or northern Italy. Things began to change in the modern period, and these are the key dates that we have to keep in mind. First, in 1898, the first photographs were taken by Secundo Pio, and this is a picture of the photographer with his apparatus, which revealed a positive image showing that the shroud itself is a negative, and that a negative of a picture that is taken of it turns out to be the positive. The amount of detail which came out of the negative that Secundo Pio had developed absolutely astounded him. If we put a picture of the shroud as it actually appears, which is here on the left, and compare it to the one on the right, we can see that there is a great more detail that comes out, processed negative, than was there in the original. And we can certainly see that in the face itself. The photographs of Secundo Pio were not widely distributed in various medias, especially the print media. So for most of the Catholic and Christian world, knowledge about the shroud's existence continued to be sketchy at best. Even more so whether it was genuine or not among those who knew about its existence. Things began to take a change, however, when in January of 1950 a book was published. Authored by Pierre Barbet, M.D., which was a forensic examination using full-length pictures of the shroud that revealed many hitherto unknown facts about Christ's crucifixion. Dr. Barbet presumed that it was Christ's shroud. In fact, this was the first instance where I even learned about the shroud, which shows how mistaken Rabbi Tovia is in claiming that it is the only evidence, which he later walked back and said it was the best evidence that Christians have to pin their beliefs in their religion on. Well, if that's the case, the Catholic Church has certainly done a pretty bad job of proclaiming this important fact. I'm the product of 11 of 12 years of secondary school in parochial Catholic institutions, and was at the time either a late sophomore or early junior at the Catholic University of America, and had never even heard of the shroud. Came across Dr. Barbet's book in the gift shop of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know which institution or religion would hide the best evidence of its legitimacy under a basket like that. It would be equivalent to a devout synagogue-attending Jew not learning until my age, which was about 25 or 26, something about Abraham or Moses or the Torah. That would make no sense. Now, the shroud was not, at least for the first half of the 20th century, considered to be the Church's best evidence for its legitimacy, although the shroud in the first part of this century has come to reach a higher status. But there's far much more compelling evidence in support of God's providential concern for Christianity, and especially for the Catholic Church, throughout the past 2,000 years than the shroud itself. One example, in fact, really a mass of them, some 2,000 or more, is contained in an article published in the National Geographic in December of 2015, entitled Mary, the Most Powerful Woman in the World. Some 2,000 apparitions over the course of the last 2,000 years, an average of one a year. Now, many of these have not been investigated by the Church, and I may get into further detail on that in a later video. Furthermore, the Vatican, through any of its media outlets, whether in print, radio, or TV, has never taken an official position one way or the other as to whether the shroud is genuine or not. Dr. Barbet's book, published almost 75 years ago, is 198 pages long So it contains a great deal of material which has been culled from the photographs of Secundo Pia. It has gone through at least 4 printings. It has been translated from French into many languages and is still available through booksellers to this day. A rather remarkable achievement if Rabbi Tovia Singer is correct, and the Shroud of Turin has been nothing but a medieval fake and a fraud. Fakes and frauds don't have that kind of long-standing reputation. The next important event that occurred in the history of the Shroud was the 1978 Stirp investigations. How this team of scientists were brought together is a fascinating story in itself and worth a minute or two going into its history. In the 1970s, scientists applied a VP8 analyzer, which was used for scientific research, to a picture of the Shroud of Turin. Now, usually, whenever the analyzer was used in this way, the results were totally confounding. You couldn't make heads or tails out of what ended up showing on the screen. As in the case of the Shroud, however, they were absolutely dumbfounded by the results. Here you could clearly see proper elevations and depressions of the face and the body as you find it on the Shroud of Turin. This led some of these researchers to float the idea that maybe the entire shroud should be scientifically examined. And for the next 2 years, they gathered together a group of scientists determined on the different kinds of technologies that they wanted to use in order to investigate the shroud, requested access to it, which was granted. This was the formation of the Stirp team. The Stirp is an acronym for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, an investigation by 30 scientists, 2 of which at least were Jewish, that confirmed that the image is of a real, scourged, crucified man and not the product of an artist. They were not interested in determining whether it was the burial shroud of Christ or not, but simply concluding whatever they could from the information that they gathered through the various technologies which they used for a 78-hour period where they were allowed total and complete access to the shroud for whatever investigations they wished to conduct. Even more interest in the shroud, and knowledge of it began to spread far and wide throughout the Christian world. However, in 1988, a number of carbon dating tests were done, the conclusion of which reported the origin of the shroud to be somewhere between 1260 and 1390. This was very disconcerting to people like myself, who had known quite a lot about the shroud and were astounded that an article that had contributed so much information about the crucifixion process that modern human beings didn't know about should have come from a phony or fake religious relic. Persons who were involved in the production and selling of phony relics wouldn't take time to make something as complicated as the shroud. They wanted something simple. They would say, this is something that was part of the crown that was placed on Jesus' head, or a piece of wood. This comes from the true cross. Or a shawl. This was a scarf that Mary wore. That sort of thing. Not something as involved and complicated as the shroud itself. So there was a great disconnect here between what we knew of the shroud up until the carbon dating and the results of the carbon dating itself. However, we have to note that there were problems with the carbon dating right from the start. The protocols that had been put in place were changed. Originally, the testing labs were supposed to be 7, each of them getting 3 pieces from the shroud that were about the size, half the size of an elongated postage stamp. Virtually at the last moment, the protocols were changed, and the number of testing laboratories was reduced from 7 to 3. The reason for this was to reduce the number of samples that would have to be cut away from the shroud, reducing it from 21 to only 9. Secondly, and this is even more important, the samples that were taken were not from different parts of the shroud, as the original protocols had demanded, but only from one corner section. The conclusions of these tests is such. It was determined to a degree of 95% accuracy that the shroud was of medieval origin. We were left with a question. How could it be that a relic, which had contributed so much unknown information about, well, if not Christ's crucifixion, certainly crucifixion in the past, be a fake and a fraud? Since then, there has been a scientific reevaluation, although there's no question about the radiocarbon testing itself. There is a criticism about the choice of the samples being taken for the testing, with suggestions that these may represent a medieval repair fragment, one of the often handled upper corners, rather than the image as a whole. For instance, here's an artist's rendering of the shroud being displayed by angels. Well, in the world, it was human beings that displayed it, holding the shroud over here at different corners over and over again every time that they wrapped it or unwrapped it for display. A certain amount of wear and tear would occur that would require repairs, and this is where the samples were taken from one of those corners. Raymond Rogers, the director of chemical research for STIRP, was an adamant defender of the carbon-14 testing. And every time someone wrote an article or a radio or television interview where they cast doubts about the validity of the carbon-14 testing, he would say, why are they continuing to try to find a way out of this? The carbon-14 has made the case quite clear that this is a medieval object. Well, he was involved in this project since 1978. Somewhere around the turn of the century, someone said, you have to re-examine the samples as others had done, because they found that somehow cotton had been intermingled with the linen fibers. And that is something that goes against Jewish law. Whenever an article of cloth is weaved, it must be weaved only from one source and one source only. A blended weaving using fibers from 2 different sources is forbidden according to Jewish law. After his analysis, Raymond Rogers stated that the radiocarbon sample contained both gum, dye, and mordant coating and cotton fibers. He agreed. The main part of the shroud does not contain these materials, he said. So he speculated that these must have been as a result of repair work, and that the conclusions of the laboratories no longer could be used in order to determine the true age of the shroud. Since the 1980s, over 170 peer-reviewed academic papers have examined the shroud, with many concluding that it is authentic. Earlier investigations in the 1970s explored whether the images were created by painting, scorching, or other means, but no definite method was ever identified. Scientists have looked at this, Artists have looked at this. Specialists in various disciplines have looked at it. No one can definitively state how the image came on the cloth. And furthermore, that it is impossible to duplicate the shroud in all of the complexities that we find in it. The latest study is from researchers at Italy's Institute of Crystallography of the National Research Council, who applied a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering to date the shroud. In 2017, another team from the same institute found evidence of blood from a torture victim on the shroud, identifying substances like creatine and ferritin, which are usually present in victims of severe trauma. These findings contradict the theory that the image was painted by medieval forgers. These analyses place the shroud's origin within the 1st century AD, further supporting its authenticity. Now, science cannot state definitively whether the person in the shroud was Jesus or not. Science is only interested in the universal, not the particular. It can state that this was a crucified man and who was tortured in the way that it is described in the gospel as happening to Jesus. It was not the standard practice among the Romans, if they were going to crucify someone, to scourge them before that punishment was carried out. The reason is they wanted that person to hang on that cross for as long as possible, in as much agony as possible, to serve as a billboard to the rest of the people to show them what's going to happen if they don't kowtow to the Roman authorities and what they demand of him. One is left with the question of who else could it possibly be? Furthermore, not only do we have the scourging marks all over the body, from which, by the way, it was determined that one of the Roman soldiers who was scourging Jesus was somewhat taller than the other, but we also have the blood that is flowing from the head, which shows that there was some kind of a puncturing instrument that had been placed there as well. Here again, this is not a practice that we know of as being common when executing a criminal. Well, you put all of this together, and the odds become increasingly more and more improbable that this could have been anybody but Jesus himself. So what can we conclude from this? If Jesus leaves us with an image of himself, an image that over time goes from a very dim, almost imperceivable figure on a linen cloth to one that becomes more highly visible when it is photographed and you look at the negative of the shroud, to one that becomes scientifically examined so much that today it is known that there is no object in human history that has undergone more scientific treatment than the shroud itself. And that when we apply AI technology to what is contained in the shroud, we get an even clearer picture of what Jesus most probably looked like. And it is something like this. If Jesus leaves us with an image of himself, what human being, as far as a Christian is concerned, has a right to say that the use of imagery in our worship services is idolatry? That just does not follow. In closing, I want to thank viewers for watching. I will be keeping an eye on the comments section, especially if there are any of Rabbi Tovia's Singer's viewers that have any response to the material presented here, and ask you to keep watch for the next two videos, which I intend to record, responding to Rabbi Tovia's negative criticisms to the Catholic practice of intercessory prayer and the negative statements that he makes about the central act of worship for most Christians, the Eucharist.